That's happening now. Okay, and yeah, just a few housekeeping comments before I introduce Jonathan. One is I've tried to mute everyone, and if I haven't, if you could mute yourself, please, and stay muted until Jonathan finishes his presentation, and then we'll have we'll open it to discussion. But it's helpful if everyone mutes themselves so that any noise doesn't interfere with the presentation. The other point I'd like to make is that at the for the question period, what I will do is ask you to raise your hand. There's a icon in the lower right of your screen that, if you can see my screen now, I've raised my hand, and that will let me know that you have a question for Jonathan or like to make a comment. And then when you're finished, if you would use the same icon to lower your hand.
It was a long decision. People contacted me, certain mayors contacted me.
Okay, everyone, again, please mute yourselves so that we don't have any interference. And I think that's all of the preliminaries we need. And I'll now welcome you all to this session of the Economy of Enough, presented by our Climate Declaration. We're going into the second year of our series on looking at various aspects of a sustainable and just transition from our current status, which is neither. I think Jonathan is the first speaker that we've had back a second time. About a year ago, he did a presentation for us on long-term governance. And that webinar is on our Climate Declaration website with many of the other webinars that we've had over the 2-year period. And if you're not familiar with them, I would encourage you to have a look. And there are many interesting presentations there. Okay, enough for preliminaries. Again, welcome all. Jonathan is the Emeritus Professor at the Victoria University of Wellington, and has had a long-term interest on the issues relating to environment and governance. And I'm very grateful to him for being one of the few academics who's actually struggling with this issue of biophysical limits, something that's incredibly important, but too often ignored. So Jonathan has written a recent article in Policy Quarterly, which is available on this very issue of biophysical limits, and looking at the similarities and differences between the green growth and degrowth approaches to dealing with biophysical limits. And he's going to make a presentation for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll open it to questions and discussion. So Jonathan, we'll turn it over to you from there, and look forward to your presentation.
All right, well, thank you very much, Jack. I hope everyone can hear. It's great to have such a wealth of expertise online. There are people here with immense knowledge in many areas that I'm going to be covering, far more knowledge than I have. So I look forward to learning, as well as, I hope, contributing during the next hour and a half or so. Thank you, Jack, for mentioning the Peace and Policy Quarterly. Just to say, for those of you who aren't familiar with Policy Quarterly, it's a journal produced by the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies within the School of Government at Victoria University. It's free, it's online. You just need to Google Policy Quarterly, VUW, and you'll get it. And the last issue was specifically on environmental issues, and some of the authors of articles in the May issue are online tonight. So good to see you. All right, well, without any more ado, I should be able to move this thing, but I can't. So I'm going to have to, there we go, it's moving, right. Good. So just to start with, a couple of weeks ago, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said half of humanity is in the danger zone from floods, droughts, extreme storms, and wildfires. No nation is immune, yet we continue to feed our fossil fuel addiction. We have a choice, collective action or collective suicide. It's in our hands. And Catherine Booth, a reformer last century, said, to better the future, we must disturb the present. And I think both quotes are highly pertinent. We are in a dire strait, ecologically, globally, and locally, and we need to disturb the present to have a better future. So what I want to do very quickly is to make some preliminary points, comment extremely briefly on biophysical limits, and then move on to clarifying some of the concepts that are relevant for tonight's discussion, specifically GDP, green growth, degrowth, decoupling, and so forth. Briefly comment on the key areas of agreement and disagreement, and then move on to what I think are the key technical, policy, and political issues at the heart of the debate. And I hope I can get through this material in half an hour. There's lots of slides. I'm going to pass through some of them very quickly. I or Jack can send you the slides if you're subsequently. So the purpose really is to facilitate a conversation rather than to argue for a particular point of view. As many of you will be aware, there's an absolutely vast literature now on issues around growth and degrowth, A growth and brown growth and so on. And that literature is growing rapidly. Much of that literature highlights that the issues we're dealing with are complex, there's much uncertainty, and there are many areas of disagreement. And it seems to me that in an uncertain world, we need due humility and openness, always to the possibility that we might be wrong. However, sort of vigorously we proclaim our particular views. So I'm certainly approaching this topic with, I hope, some degree of humility. Having said that, there seems to be incontrovertible evidence that we face real non-negotiable biophysical limits, and that we are exceeding some of those safe biophysical limits in the way we live our lives through consumption and production. So currently, globally, some of our actions are clearly unsustainable ecologically. And this relates both to the use and misuse of resources, but also exceeding the absorptive capacity of the biosphere. So I don't think there's much doubt that we need rapid and radical policy shifts globally in order to avoid overshoot and collapse. The key questions really are around, well, what sort of policy changes do we need? What is technically and politically feasible? And how do we get this kind of global cooperation that we need? I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, will be familiar with the work of the Stockholm Resilience Center and many researchers connected with it. I'm not going to go through this, but basically we are exceeding safe biophysical limits in a number of important areas, such as biodiversity loss, greenhouse gas emissions, and so forth. And of course, we witness terrible scenes like this all over the world repeatedly at the moment. So let me just clarify a few concepts. When we're talking about green growth and degrowth and so on, one of the most critical concepts is gross domestic product. And gross domestic product, or GDP, is a monetary measure. It reflects the market value of all the final goods and services, be they electrical goods or cars or whatever, produced over a specified time period. Here in New Zealand, we measure GDP quarterly as well as annually, and we need to distinguish between real GDP and nominal GDP. If you've got a high rate of inflation, then your GDP is going to be going up simply because of the movement in the consumer price index, but that may not reflect any movement in actual real GDP, which may be static. GDP is not a measure of physical properties, resource use, or energy flows, nor is it a measure of total resource throughput. But obviously, it's going to be linked in various ways to total resource throughput, and that's one of the issues we'll be discussing shortly. Also, it's very clear that GDP is not a measure of human well-being or necessarily of human progress. And I think many greengrowthers and degrowthers are fully aligned on that point. Total global GDP comprises the aggregate of national GDPs and currently stands at around US 95 trillion, of which around a quarter is the economy of the United States. GDP growth has both costs in the form of ecological, social, cultural impacts, and also various benefits. For example, reducing poverty and hardship. GDP growth in China, for example, over the last 30 to 40 years has clearly reduced poverty rates, certainly relative poverty rates, and absolute poverty rates among hundreds and hundreds of millions of people in that part of the world. The focus for this talk is very much on global GDP and real GDP growth, not nominal. And the time frame I'm thinking about here is really this century, but particularly the next 30 years. So that's the sort of time frame and the focus. It's a global focus, not a New Zealand focus. Clarifying a few more concepts, and I think somebody needs to mute, please. Somebody needs to mute. Pat, have you got your mute on, please?
My apologies.
Right.
I'll find it. Sorry. Yep, I'll find it. You can mute me. I thought I was muted. Sorry.
Well, you're not.
No.
Sorry.
Okay. Sorry. I'll deal with it if I can.
Okay. So
Yeah.
The next concept is decoupling. Now, decoupling, I think, is absolutely central to this debate. There is some equivocation by some contributors as to whether that is the case. But from my point of view, decoupling is crucial. And decoupling is about reducing the amount of renewable and non-renewable resources that are used to produce gross domestic product. And it's about delinking economic development from both resource use on the one hand and environmental impacts on the other. So there's a distinction here between what's called resource decoupling and impact decoupling. Resource decoupling is delinking GDP from resource use, whether in aggregate or for particular resources, including overall energy decoupling, and within that, fossil fuel decoupling and so forth. Impact decoupling is about delinking GDP growth from environmental impacts, including biodiversity losses, increased greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. And there's also a critical distinction here between relative decoupling and absolute decoupling. So relative decoupling is a situation where the growth in resources and or environmental impacts is slower than GDP growth. But if GDP growth is significant and your decoupling is minor, then you're actually getting more resource and environmental impacts. To get absolute decoupling, you need a rate of resource and or impact decoupling that is greater than your rate of GDP growth. So if, for example, you have, as we do at the moment, global GDP per capita growing at about 2% annually on average, then for absolute decoupling, whether it be resource decoupling or impact decoupling, you need the decoupling rate to exceed 2% per annum. If it doesn't, then of course you're having more resource and impact effects. So that's really absolutely critical for people to understand these distinctions between resource and impact decoupling and relative and absolute decoupling. Now, while I think decoupling is at the heart of this debate between advocates of green growth and advocates of degrowth, not all degrowth advocates see it that way. And I've quoted here from a recent paper, or at least review by Timothy Parakree, in which he says, and I quote, "The decoupling literature is a black hole of abstract technical subtleties with very little useful insights for how to actually reduce environmental pressures. The question of decoupling GDP from nature is rather absurd." Well, to be frank, I really don't understand what he's saying. And indeed, in the same piece, he writes, quoting Schmelzler, positively, he says, "The point instead is to move towards an economy in which well-being can increase while environmental damage rapidly declines, thereby decoupling prosperity from ecological impact and thus also from economic growth." So forgive me, he can't have it both ways. Either decoupling matters or it doesn't. In my view, it does. So if we are to achieve absolute resource and absolute impact decoupling, which arguably is absolutely essential for ecological sustainability, then we have roughly three options or some combination of those options. We can reduce the growth rate of the global population, indeed shift to a decline in global population. We can reduce the growth rate of global GDP per capita, and or we can increase the rate of resource and impact decoupling. Now, just to note that changing the growth rate of the global population is not straightforward. We currently have about 8 billion people on the planet, and recent projections indicate that that is likely to rise over the next 28 years to about 9.7 billion, roughly a 20% increase. If these projections are correct, then to achieve absolute decoupling, be it resource or impact decoupling, we will either have to reduce global GDP per capita, or we will have to increase the rate of resource and impact decoupling very significantly, or some combination of the two. And in my mind, the critical policy questions are about how do we do that, okay? So what's happening recently in relation to decoupling, just quickly summarizing a little bit of the evidence. Globally, there appears to be a close correlation between aggregate resource use, that's including all sort of raw materials and energy and so forth, and environmental impacts, but actual impacts depend on the specific resources and technologies being used. Secondly, globally, there is some evidence of relative resource and impact decoupling, but very little evidence at a global level of absolute decoupling, either of resource or impact decoupling. At the national level, there are many examples of both relative and absolute resource and impact decoupling over recent decades. But in many cases, that's due to shifts in production to other countries. So in some parts of Europe, like Germany, there has been some absolute resource decoupling and some absolute impact decoupling in some areas. But that's as much due to shifting production to China and other parts of the world as it is to actual global reductions. Overall, in recent decades, the combination of global GDP per capita growth at around 2% per annum on average, and population growth around 1% per annum, that has exceeded efforts to achieve absolute resource and impact decoupling in an aggregate sense, at least. There may be some specific exceptions to that with particular environmental impacts or particular resources. So it seems to me among the really crucial questions we need to address in the light of this is, well, what rates of resource and impact decoupling are needed for global ecological sustainability? Are the rates that are required technically possible? What policy changes would be necessary to achieve such rates? Are such policy changes feasible politically in some of the big economies as well as globally? And other things being equal, will a higher rate of global GDP per capita, say around 2% per annum, will that make it easier or harder to increase the rate of resource and or impact decoupling? If a degree of GDP growth makes it easier, then the question then becomes, well, will a higher rate of global GDP growth per capita fully offset the increased rate of decoupling, resulting either in no absolute decoupling or a rate of absolute decoupling that is too slow for sustainability? And if not, then, well, a lower or negative rate of global GDP growth per capita will be essential. So in other words, if a faster rate of economic growth is offset by fails to achieve an adequately faster rate of absolute decoupling, both impact and resource decoupling, then clearly it's not going to achieve the global goal of ecological sustainability. So that's one of the key questions, and I want to come back to that shortly. So let's quickly turn to the sort of edited highlights of the debate between those who advocate growth and those who advocate degrowth. Now, there are some areas of agreement. Pretty well everyone involved in this debate, I think, agrees that there are real non-negotiable biophysical limits at multiple scales, planetary and subplanetary. There is obviously some disagreement about precisely where those limits are. There's a recognition that failure to live within those limits will have widespread, severe, and often irreversible consequences ecologically, socially, politically, economically, and so forth. Currently, there's broad agreement that policy settings globally and in many countries are inconsistent with ecological sustainability. So we risk serious overshoot and then potential collapse. So there has to be a significant change. And I think there's broad agreement that any transition to a more sustainable global economy has to be based on robust ethical foundations, including well-established principles of distributive and compensatory justice, as well as a concern for intergenerational well-being, which among other things means that for the poorest countries of the world, you can't expect them not to develop further, realistically, which means, amongst other things, that the developed world needs to bear a greater burden than the developed and developing worlds in achieving the global goals that are necessary. Having said that, there's obviously, for those of you who've read any of the literature, some areas of disagreement between green growth and degrowth advocates, but also disagreements within both camps. And those disagreements within the camps reflect all kinds of kind of philosophical as well as technical differences. There are differences around what the policy prescriptions are that people recommend. There are differences about the best ways of achieving radical shifts, for example, in energy systems and so on and so on. Where there is clearly agreement is that GDP is an imperfect measure of societal progress, but whereas green growth advocates believe that certainly the continuing GDP growth remains a legitimate, if not an essential policy objective, degrowth advocates, or at least most of them, dispute this claim. But even then, I have to say, there are degrowth advocates who are perhaps not quite so anti-GDP growth as others. So I've quoted here Jason Hickel. Many of you will be familiar with his work from his book, Less is More. He said, let me emphasize that degrowth is not about reducing GDP. Slowing down unnecessary extraction and production may mean that GDP grows more slowly or stops growing or even declines. What I am calling for is about shifting to a different kind of economy altogether, an economy that doesn't need to grow in the first place. To get there, we need to rethink everything. Now, I appreciate there's a number of different elements to that, but it's pretty clear that the focus of his effort or attention is not necessarily about reducing GDP growth, though he acknowledges that slowing it down may be an inevitable byproduct of the kind of changes that he sees as essential for ecological sustainability. Though I suspect many green growth advocates would accept that proposition as well. So let me turn now quickly to the technical policy and political issues that I think lie at the heart of this debate, and just raise some of the critical questions for further discussion. So technical questions, there's a multiplicity of those, but here are a few. The first is, what rates of resource and impact decoupling are needed at the global level for global ecological sustainability? And then secondly, how do these rates vary across different resources, including energy sources of various kinds, and environmental impacts, and indeed environmental impacts of various kinds? Thirdly, are the required rates of resource and impact decoupling technically feasible? For example, what is the sort of rate of decarbonization needed to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, and can that be achieved? And fourthly, would further GDP growth hinder or help the required rates of resource and impact decoupling. So those are among the sort of critical technical, if you like, questions. Among the policy questions are, well, what precise policy changes are needed to achieve, or at least seek to achieve, the required rates of resource and impact decoupling? And to what extent, amongst other things, can governments actually influence the rate and pattern of GDP growth, and how best can they influence such outcomes? And then there's a whole heap of political economy or governance questions, which is probably, to the extent I have any expertise in this area, my primary area of research. Are the required policy changes feasible politically? And we have to think about this globally, as well as, of course, in particularly the major economies. And if so, under what conditions? Secondly, would a degrowth policy program, in which you are deliberately actually seeking to, at the very least, not grow further in terms of GDP, but probably also contract GDP, especially in advanced economies, would a degrowth policy program be politically sustainable and sustainable for long enough to achieve its goals? And if so, under what conditions? And then thirdly, is the required level of global cooperation possible? Because it might be possible to achieve degrowth in some economies, but for there to be adequate global impacts, obviously you need a substantial number of, particularly the major economies, major developed economies, going in the same direction. All right, so there are multiple uncertainties in answering all those questions. There are technological sort of uncertainties about the nature, speed, uptake, and impact of new technologies and sort of breakthrough technologies. There's issues around the nature and scale of resource substitutability. There are lots of debates, as many of you will be aware, around the energy return on investment, the EROI, particularly in relation to specific renewable energy sources such as solar and wind. There is a significant literature also on the sort of social cultural constraints to policy reform and behavioral change on the part of citizens. There's quite a lot of literature around sort of politics and power and the capacity and willingness of policymakers to undertake transformative reforms. And then there's obviously the big issues around securing global collaboration. So let me just focus in on one of the critical technical issues, if you like, namely what kind of rate of global decarbonization is necessary. And then secondly, would economic growth enhance the rate of global decarbonization, in this case, absolute decoupling of GDP from greenhouse gas emissions, or would it make the problem worse? Now, let me just offer a few quick reflections. I realize there are people online who know a lot about these topics, but let me just make a few quick observations. So to turn to the global decarbonization issue, cutting to the chase, if we were to limit global warming to roughly 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels with, say, 2/3 sort of certainty, then we need roughly a 45% reduction in global carbon dioxide emissions within the next 8 years, compared with 2010 levels. And that implies a rate of reduction in the vicinity of 8 to 10% per annum for the next 8 years, depending on the rate of global GDP growth, moving eventually, of course, by 2050 to negative net emissions, and for that to continue for an extended period. To achieve such reductions will require, among other things, absolutely massive expansion of renewable energy technologies, or RETs. Indeed, it's estimated that the total renewable energy capacity would need to double roughly every 5 to 8 years until 2050. And that would require an unprecedented level of capital investment, at least against historical levels of investment in RETs. We'd need to replace and or retire the entire global vehicle fleet of roughly 1.4 billion cars, trucks, and vans, and obviously rely to a much greater extent on efficient public transport and active transport. We would need large-scale afforestation and soil regeneration. We would need significant reductions in energy intensity, significant efficiency improvements in non-energy related resource use, and significant changes in global food production and consumption. Now, those are pretty demanding kinds of achievements, and we're not doing very well currently. And then there's all the sort of multiple technical and other obstacles to achieving those goals. And I've just listed some of them here that most of you will be familiar with. First of all, there's the question whether or not bioenergy with carbon capture and storage would work. And if it won't, for a whole variety of reasons, then of course, arguably achieving the sorts of reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and subsequent going to negative net emissions will be all the harder. Then there's the problem that a heavy reliance on electrical vehicle technologies, EVs and so on, will require arguably greater overall electricity generating capacity unless we, of course, somehow miraculously cease relying on vehicular transport to a greater extent than we have. To achieve the required development of renewable energy technologies, including EV technologies and so on, will require a significant use of fossil fuels in the meantime, simply to build all the new plants and equipment that are going to be necessary. Many of you will be familiar with the huge new production facilities that various car manufacturers like VW and Tesla and Ford and so on are investing in. Well, they require energy, of course, to produce, and in many cases, that energy is coming from fossil fuel sources. So there's all those issues, and then there are many concerns about the energy return on energy investment, many concerns about the availability of the resources that are going to be needed for the energy transition, things like cobalt, lithium, rare earth materials, and so on, and a concern about where some of those materials are located, often in geopolitically unstable countries. And then there's the problem of just simply replacing an enormous amount of equipment that will eventually need replacing as it wears out. So lots of issues in that respect. And I've listed here just a few more, and I'm going to wrap up shortly, but just a few more of the sorts of problems that we need to reckon with. Things like supply chain problems. We've witnessed that with COVID, and now with the war in Eastern Europe. Well, climate change is going to generate a large number of supply chain problems with, huge storm damage. Think of the floods in Bangkok that had significant impacts on some supply chain issues, and so on. It was back in 2011. There's been huge floods in Seoul recently, and I suspect that will be having some impact on production. Then you've got all the path dependencies and lags in various production systems. Think how long it's going to take to replace our vehicle fleet in New Zealand if we are serious about it, moving to EVs, given that the average age is 14 years. And we've got whatever 4 million vehicles. And then you think about this from a global point of view, path dependencies and lags are going to make the challenge very hard. And that includes the problems of changing consumer preferences and demand for various goods and services. You've got storage issues with respect to various renewable energy technologies. And you've got also, the impacts of climate change on the capacity to use some of your renewable energy technologies. Right now in Europe, France is struggling to produce enough energy from nuclear sources, partly because the rivers are too warm to run your power stations, nuclear power stations. Norway is having to cut back on production of hydro electricity because of the severe drought, and so on and so on. Then you've got geopolitical constraints of various kinds, and they are writ large now, tragically as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the conflicts, obviously, in other parts of the world. You've got, as I mentioned, some key resources being in unstable, non-democratic countries with the potential for sort of hold up or hostage seeking, so to speak. And you've got the environmental impacts of various kinds of mining. So big issues there. Now, moving just from the issue of decarbonisation to the question of, will GDP growth, even at a moderate rate, facilitate a faster energy transition, and thus, in this case, a faster resource decoupling than would otherwise be the case? The argument from advocates of green growth is essentially that a moderate rate of GDP growth, and we're thinking here globally, will enhance the availability of investment funds for investing in renewable energy technologies, electric vehicle technologies, and so on, and will also increase the incentives for such investment. You've also got sort of political economy arguments. For example, GDP growth, it is argued, will supply more fiscal resources for reallocation, including subsidies for low carbon technologies, and also provision for income transfers to low income earners to cover the costs of the transition. I don't know, some of you may know a lot more than I do about the measures that the Biden administration has managed to achieve through Congress in the last few days. But clearly that's a substantial amount of money, hundreds of billions. Would that be possible in an economy which is declining rather than growing? Then there's the issues around whether you can achieve, there's the point that a major technological transition will probably result in major improvements in efficiency and productivity, thereby increasing per capita incomes and actually boosting GDP growth, and so on. So the key argument, at least from the green growth side of it, is that with some growth, you both facilitate greater private investment in the technologies that you need for the transition, and you also create more public resources through growth to redistribute and to support a decarbonisation strategy at the political and policy levels. Against that, there are concerns on the part of green growthers that a degrowth strategy would prompt significant public resistance. It could prompt a global financial crisis, which might impact very negatively on unemployment, poverty, and so on, including increasing political instability, which would then make the strategy of decarbonisation all the harder. I'm not going to talk about the policy issues. Many of you online know a great deal about this, and I would simply commend the article by David Hall and Robert McLaughlin on the relative merits of price-based mechanisms versus non-price-based mechanisms for achieving decarbonisation. But there's also a range of other issues, orthodox versus unorthodox sort of policy prescriptions. There's a question about, well, what is actually possible in kind of a peacetime, and also what's possible in a democracy relative, say, to a dictatorship. We can come back to those perhaps later. Just a few other points before sort of wrapping up. I think a very significant part of the debate about how we achieve the required levels of resource and impact decoupling are really political matters about how rapidly we can shift public opinion, the opinion of political elites, and thus the decisions that individual citizens, investors, and others make in their daily lives and in their contribution to public life. So I think there's a heap of sort of political/governance questions which need addressing, and it might be worth reflecting briefly on the sort of positive and negative lessons from COVID-19 in that regard. At the positive end, COVID-19 demonstrated the capacity for urgent, comprehensive, radical, and indeed unorthodox policy responses to an immediate large-scale threat to human life. And we witnessed in the last 2.5 years policy shifts that probably most of us would have thought were unthinkable, closing the borders virtually completely for long periods of time, massive subsidies for to maintain employment, and other interventions that were of an unprecedented nature. However, that was in the context of an immediate large-scale threat to human life. And part of the problem with the ecological crises we face is that many people do not perceive these crises as being of the same order of something like COVID. So one of the questions there is how do we change people's mindset so they understand the true magnitude of what is at stake and the urgency of radical changes. Also, just note that while we managed to get, certainly in New Zealand and many other countries, significant public cooperation and collaboration with efforts to address the COVID pandemic, that cooperation and collaboration didn't last on the part of the whole population for very long. We soon ended up with opposition to various government initiatives, and that opposition grew. And here in New Zealand, of course, we witnessed the terrible events at Parliament. So it just highlights the limits to public tolerance and the limits to people's willingness to make sacrifices. And that's worth thinking about in terms of what is at stake ahead of us. So just to briefly conclude and then turn it over to everyone else online. Rapid decarbonisation this decade, in the next 8 years, at the rates needed to meet the requirements of the Paris Agreement seems to me to be very unlikely. Regardless of all the technical issues, the political will seems to me to be still lacking in many, if not most, countries, including here in New Zealand. The current war in Eastern Europe may increase the use of high carbon fuels in the short run. It may, on the other hand, and it's going to be interesting to watch, it may also unleash significant investment in renewable energy technologies and electric vehicle technologies over the medium term. And of course, the role of Germany as a pivotal global player in this context could be pivotal. So that's a possible hopeful sign. But in the meantime, the war is clearly very negative for all sorts of reasons. It seems to me there's going to be continuing uncertainty over the development and uptake of new sort of breakthrough technologies. And thus, that's one reason why it seems to me we need some humility about what might be technically possible over the coming decades. But in my view, at the heart of the challenges we face are a series of governance issues. So let me just finish with a statue from the Finnish Parliament. This is what Finnish MPs look at each day as they debate various issues, including big policy issues affecting their future. They look at a mother and child, and the child is looking out at them. And clearly, this is sort of an evocative picture of the need for us to focus on the future, to be thinking about our children and their children, and ensuring that we do our very, very best to avoid some kind of absolute ecological catastrophe. So thank you. The words of St. Augustine: hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain as they are. And may I pay tribute to the courage of many of you online, some of whom I know personally, who have demonstrated enormous courage over recent years and decades in the efforts to secure a more sustainable planet. So thanks for your time. I'm sorry if I've gone a bit long. I hope there's plenty of time for discussion. Jack, back over to you.
That's terrific, Jonathan. Thank you very much for that terrific overview of I won't even say problems, because problems are solvable, but the predicaments that we face. Again, in terms of housekeeping, as you can see in my upper left corner of my screen, I've used the reaction button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And so if you have a question or would like to make a comment, yeah, please use that. And while people are formulating their questions, I have a couple that I'd like to put to you, Jonathan.
Sure.
One issue has to do with the history of having exceeded biophysical limits or overshoot.
Yeah.
We know from the ecological footprint data that we have been in overshoot since at least 1950, 1960. So for the last 70 years, we've been in overshoot, and it's increasing over that time frame. And there seems to be very little discussion of the magnitude of the issue we face. I mean, we're just beginning to come to grips with the fact that we're in overshoot. Everyone, please ensure that they keep themselves mute. Thank you. And what are your thoughts about the magnitude of the issue, the information that we have, and why it generally seems to be avoided? That's one question. The second question has to do with your emphasis on decoupling. And the question I'd like to put to you is it important, you and many others frame this in terms of decoupling GDP. And there's another way of looking at it, and that is to consider the impact of material throughput, energy and material flows through the economy, because it's the energy and material flows that do the damage, the ecological damage, and push us into overshoot. Mm. And while it's highly related to GDP, it's not the same. And why use a proxy when we have better ways of measuring throughput? And if we can come to grips with throughput, perhaps we could then adjust our economic system to coincide with operating within those limits. Mm.
So Jack, I'll be very brief because I think there's others on the line who probably can answer some of those questions better than I. Just on your second question, there's clearly a close coupling between GDP and resource throughput, certainly at the aggregate level, but not necessarily for all resources, Jack. So conceptually, you could shift the pattern and structure of your resource use in ways that might, for example, significantly reduce environmental impacts. For example, moving from fossil fuel sources of energy to renewable energy sources. And so you might, in that context, keep a particular aggregate level of throughput, but with substantially reduced ecological impacts. So others, I'm sure, will have some views about that. So, and all that could happen in the context potentially of GDP either remaining static or growing at the global level, potentially. Having said that, of course, going back to your first question, overshoot, undeniably, there are areas where we are in overshoot and have been for some considerable time. Greenhouse gas emissions have clearly been exceeding the capacity of the biosphere to absorb, and thus have been accumulating in terms of their concentrations in the atmosphere for a very long time. So we've been overshoot in that specific area for significant time, Jack, and that matter has finally received the kind of attention politically, globally, that it should, though we've not yet responded adequately. The problem is that many of the other areas of overshoot haven't attracted the same level of public attention, Jack. So biodiversity loss, for example, or soil loss, or whatever it might be. And I think that's a failure of our sort of political system, our media, and perhaps in some ways of our scientific communities as well, in ensuring that these issues get the attention they deserve. But look, I'll leave it over to others who probably have greater wisdom and insight on some of these things than I.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. So we have some hands up, and I'm not sure the order, but what I'm going to do is ladies first. So Jane, hi, go ahead with your question.
Oh, kia ora. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm not really going to use your terminology, but I live in Taupo, and they're developing a strategy for tourism now. And I guess New Zealanders as well, actually, because we want to attract visitors again, having our borders closed for a long time. Yes. So I'm just wondering if this kind of 8 years that we're aware of on this forum, which is so dire and so immediate and pressing, and in the meantime, it's kind of, we're opening the borders, and we're even as sustainable as our local tourism aims to be, when we're just not dealing with that elephant in the room. And the same with everything that comes via ship, everything that leaves via ship, and dairy, of course, all the main exports and economic platforms that we thrive on in New Zealand, unfortunately. So it is a bit blinkered here in Taupo. I don't think they're really dealing with that. Have you got any suggestions of how to approach the local body elections on those sorts of issues?
So Jane, let me simply agree with you that encouraging international tourism in a context where most of that tourism requires significant use of fossil fuels is arguably not responsible, morally at least, in the current context. Having said that, I can understand why the tourist industry and why the New Zealand government sees it as being, at least in the short-term interest of the country, to increase the inflow of overseas tourists. But given current technologies for transport, it's inconsistent with what we need to do. If we had electric planes and electric ships or some other means of low carbon flight and sea travel, it would be a different matter. Though, of course, we'd still have to think about the resources that were being used, other resources that were being used by those ships and aircraft, and any environmental damage that they might be doing.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Molly, you're next. And if you could please lower your hand after you've asked your question, thank you. You're on mute, Molly. There you go.
Hand. Very interesting talk, Jonathan, but very driven by GDP and measures which are used to make policy by government, a system in which industrial corporates dominate the policy process. So I'm thinking of a focus on well-being. Forget the numbers, let's just look at well-being. And my own interest is driven by an article and in fact a fascinating video by Nate Hagens, is that his name?
Yep.
Talking about the superorganism.
Yeah.
Which kind of drives the way people form policy and do their collective things. And in his article called The Superorganism, a long article, he talks about forming when he believes things are going to go downhill wholly. He really believes we're approaching catastrophe. And in this coming chaos, he quotes Ilya Prigogine, who, by the way, was one of my heroes when I studied physical chemistry, who used to talk about one can form an island of coherence in a collapsing system. And I'm interested in islands of coherence in our policy, of which I believe Māori culture and actions, not the historic stuff, not the totems, but the actual way jobs were done in the whare. I believe that we can use that as a way to formulate ways forward as chaos comes. I firmly believe chaos will come. And I do recommend you read Patricia Grace's Potuki, which absolutely demonstrates what can happen when people are confident in their culture and ways of doing things.
Molly, look, thank you very much. Good to see you, and good to see so many other people I'm familiar with online. Some very brief responses. First of all, Nate Hagen's article, which you refer to, The Super Organism, is a brilliant piece, extremely well written, and I've commend it to anyone who hasn't read it. On the question of whether he's right that we face an inevitable collapse, decline, well, he may be. I'm relatively pessimistic too. I think all the indications are that we're going to run into enormous challenges as a result of the impacts of biodiversity loss, climate change, and so on, which will have profound economic, social, and political consequences globally and locally. So I'm very deeply concerned. And we're simply not making the changes fast enough. Whether indigenous cultures, whether contemporary Maori culture offers ways forward, well, that's, I think, open to debate. I mean, clearly,
Yes.
there's some fascinating and important things going on within many of the iwi that have settled with the Crown and using their resources in imaginative ways. Having said that, of course, you know, Māori are involved in many of the things that Pākehā are involved in that are relatively destructive.
Right.
Intensive dairying, international tourism, etc. But I'll stop at that point because there's lots of others who want to comment.
Thank you. Okay, Thomas, we'll go across the others.
Yeah, I'd just like to make two comments. I think, Jonathan, you made a very good speech for degrowth, because everything that is related to further growth, you pointed it out, it will just not happen. The decoupling that has been taking place so far is minuscule. It's just not happening. We see a little bit of decoupling because of efficiency in industrial processes and so on. But otherwise, we cannot put any money into decoupling. And we can also not put any bets on future innovation. We have to go with what we got. This is 2022. We are a very industrialized nation, a very industrialized world. We have made so many inventions. We have to deal with what we got. And the only way is to live with less from now on. And I think you made that call in showing how little time we have got until 2030. And the amount of reduction we have to do, this 7 to 8% every year, it's just not going to happen by any new innovation or any decoupling. That's one thing. And the other point I like to make is when you talk about growth, we should look a little bit more about the history of growth. Growth is actually a recent phenomenon, which we see since the Second World War. Before that, we have lived quite well without growth. And growth at the moment is there, again, to place bets on the future. We all grow, and there is something for the rich, and there will be something for the poor, and we all will be better off because we are having growth. I think we have to get rid of that mentality. We have to focus, as Molly said, we have to focus on actual needs that we have, and we have to focus on our well-being. And GDP is the wrong indicator for that. And I think you said that as well. So thanks for that.
Sure. No, Thomas, look, I agree with much of what you've said. Growth is a relatively new phenomenon in human history, but that is also partly because it is a relatively new phenomenon. In other words, for very long periods of human history, economies were relatively stable. There was not significant technological innovation or improvements in efficiency, and there wasn't much change over very long periods of time. That's why novelists of the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries and so on, you can read them, and they talked about people with particular incomes, and everybody understood what that meant because it didn't change over time. But the Industrial Revolution, Thomas, changed that, and we have had significant, massive GDP growth per capita globally and in most economies. The question is now, what do we do, given that we're clearly in overshoot in respect of many important matters? And I guess my concern here is that, among many concerns, is that politically persuading people to consume less, to radically change their lives and their lifestyles is very hard. Let's just think what's happened recently in New Zealand. We've had a National Party conference. What was the key message in the current leader of the opposition's conference speech? It was about reducing free riding on the part of a small number of young beneficiaries. costing the economy an absolute pittance in the overall scheme of things, and not showing any regard to actually how low the benefits are for single people who are young and who perhaps can't work because of physical or mental health issues. So I know I was just extremely disappointed by that. And then you look at the British Conservative Party candidates for Prime Minister. You know, what are they saying about the global ecological crisis and the huge environmental issues we face globally and that Britain faces? I mean, virtually nothing. In fact, if anything, what they're proposing would make things worse. So, Thomas, I hear you. I'm inclined to agree, but I'm pessimistic that one can sell the message at the moment. So the net result, I'm afraid, is very likely to be crisis and collapse. I'm sorry if I'm being unduly pessimistic, but there we go. Jack, back to you.
Yes, okay, Nathan, we can next.
Hi, thank you, Jack. Thanks for your presentation, Jonathan. My question is, and I've dropped a few links in the
thank you
chat to support this. Hopefully, won't talk too long. Oil supply. We have reached peak global oil supply in 2018. There's reasonably clear evidence that we're not going to achieve a greater total supply than that, and therefore we're now on the downslope. The downslope is projected to be something in the region of 5 to 7% per annum, and that is to say a reduction in all liquid supply. Because oil is the lifeblood of industrial civilization, diesel basically is the thing that moves everything around, including the earth, to get the raw materials out in the first place. That decline means probably something in the region of a 5 to 10% decline in energy-related economic activity, and all economic activity is energy-related. That to me seems to be a more fundamental thing. Believe me, I am not by any stretch of the imagination discounting the environmental impacts that you've talked about and the ecological knowledge of the planetary boundaries framework and so on. I fully agree that those are major, huge concerns. But I find that when people from academia and central government talk about this, they typically listen to the economists which are doing demand-based predictions of future energy rather than supply-constrained projections. I'm just wondering if you've had a look at that issue and if you have any thoughts on it, because that to me seems to be something that's probably in the driving seat at this point.
Right. So Nathan, I'm not an expert on oil markets or oil production, and there are people in the on the Zoom who know a lot more about this than I would simply make a couple of observations. I did years ago read quite a lot of the literature on peak oil, and thought that we had probably achieved peak oil quite a long time ago, and I was wrong. And I can still remember when Lord Ron Oxburgh came and talked at a climate change conference that I was involved in some 17 years ago. He was the former chair of Shell, and he was an eminent geologist in his own right, having been a professor of geology at Cambridge. And I can remember him saying that we weren't going to discover any more significant, oil fields, and that oil production would, reduce over the coming X period. Lo and behold, what happened? Oil shale came onto the market, and that's obviously had an impact. So all I say, Nathan, is, look, it's not my area of expertise. You may well be right, but we also have to bear in mind the possibility that these projections will not come to pass. And even if they did, Nathan, my understanding is, leaving aside oil, we have vastly more fossil fuels in coal, oil, and gas than we can burn if we want to have a planet that's worth living in, that's going to be habitable, probably four or five times over. So in my view, sorry, Nathan, I think the big constraint is not so much how much oil is left or how much gas is left. It's how do we stop using what's left?
Yeah. And I guess my very quick response to that is that the problem is that oil is the thing that moves things around, and specifically diesel, and that we may well have coal, etc., but we don't have the infrastructure or the built transportation devices to use those other methods of
that's right. And that was one of my points, Nathan, about the huge path dependence and lags in the systems that we've got, and I expect particularly for trucks.
Yeah, correct. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, if I just make a comment, some of you, but not all of you, may know that there is a petition before Parliament to ration fossil fuels. And if you go to the chat, you will see a link to an organization, a new degrowth organization in New Zealand that has sponsored this petition. And you can click on the degrowth website, and that will bring you to the petition if you wish to support it.
Okay.
So it's one way of trying to control and limit, and in a reasonably fair way, the availability of fossil fuels, which would decline over years. So we could actually guarantee how much emissions that we would make if we chose to go that route. And also there's a webinar on the issue of energy descent on our Climate Declaration website, if any of you are interested in that. Okay, going on to the additional hands that are up. Ralph, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Good to hear you continuing to think on these issues. Look, I thought you made an interesting point about political instability and the potential relationship with degrowth. I think that's something we need to give further attention to, especially in the light of the demonstrations outside Parliament, which were driven in part, I think, by a drop in the standard of living of a number of members of society in New Zealand. But I also want to make so I'd like your thoughts on that, but I also want to make a preliminary point, if you like, that there's an economist called Vandenberg, and I've mentioned his name to you in the past, but he's a Dutch economist who's done very interesting work, I think, about degrowth and green growth and so on. And he says, look, the way to think about this is that it's the impacts on people that really matter. It's not GDP as such. People don't actually care about GDP, but they do care about social and environmental impacts and even economic impacts. And so what we should be focusing, it seems to me, on is reducing those impacts, those detrimental impacts of the way we run our economy. And that seems a compelling sort of story that we can tell people. So reform that minimizes those impacts and reduces them over time. For example, getting rid of car dependence and so on. But if we recast that way around, I guess there's a potential for creating a future vision with at least holding the impacts of climate destabilization and so on, not so that we don't see them increasing over time. And in that context, it's conceivable that we could reduce resource use without creating too much political instability. And I think it seems conceivable that if we can find that sweet spot where we're almost shrinking the economy, but what really matters is shrinking the impacts and not creating too much political instability and disillusionment and breakdown of society, that I think is the real risk going forward. What's your thoughts on that?
Yes, so Rafe, thank you. And I've read some of the person's work that you mentioned, and well, I simply commend it. I suppose, cutting to the chase, the main debate, as you know, has been in recent years, at least, between advocates of growth and degrowth, GDP growth and degrowth. And I just wanted to highlight that. I think it would be useful, Rafe, to have a separate webinar specifically on, sorry, Vanderberg, is that right?
Yeah.
Yes, on his ideas, and maybe you could do that. But look, the crucial question that you're really posing is, how do we affect the transition that we need to affect globally and locally? In other words, what are the policy levers we can pull? And I'm a policy person, so I look at policy levers. I appreciate they're not the only thing that matters, but they are among the critical things that matter. What can we do that will affect a rapid and just transition to a very different kind of economy, one which is genuinely ecologically sustainable? And you know, and I know a lot about what sorts of policy instruments we can pull, Rafe, that would make a significant difference. The problem is to get governments to pull those levers. And whether we're thinking locally here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or we're thinking across the Tasman in Australia, or the United States, or in Europe, or in many other places, what is obvious is that it's really, really difficult to get governments to make the sorts of changes that are required at the policy level. And going back to I suppose, part of the problem, and Jack, you raised this question right at the beginning, why hasn't overshoot generated more concern, even though we've been overshoot for some things for decades? And part of the answer to that, of course, is political movements and ideological movements that are simply not interested in these sorts of issues. Part of it is the global media. You think about the enormous impact that the Murdoch press, the Murdoch empire, has had in the United States, in parts of Europe, in Australia, in this part of the world. It's been huge. I gather that Fox News has been covering the heat waves and floods and other, weather-related catastrophes that have been happening around the world in the last few months. It's been covering them almost every day, but the words climate change have never been mentioned. What does that tell you? It tells you that these people are living in a completely kind of hermetically sealed bubble that has nothing to do with what the scientific community is telling the world. And tens of millions of people, if not hundreds of millions of people, are lapping that up around the world. So we've got some really serious issues. Somebody mentioned vested interests earlier, and absolutely, we've got some extremely powerful vested interests. And well, it's extremely difficult to counter those vested interests. I'm sorry. I mean, this is the hard political challenge that we have. Many of you have been involved in environmental issues for 50 or 60 years. I can see Alan Mark somewhere, or at least yes, you are there, Alan. And well, forgive me, Alan, you've made an enormous contribution, but we've gone backwards.
Jonathan, if I could just introduce a quick question, and that is, if we need to bring along more public support and pressure on politicians to accept some of these radically different disruptive policies, do you think there's a role for citizens' assemblies in helping politicians appreciate that, with good process, that reasonable people will come to reasonable conclusions about what sort of actions we should take?
Very briefly, Jack, look, I'm a Democrat. I am a strong believer in deliberative democracy and the various institutions of deliberative democracy. Our parliament is a deliberative chamber. Citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies are deliberative chambers. I think they have considerable merit, but you won't get radical change happening in the main simply by having a few citizens' assemblies. I'm sorry. Not least because unless they have a really strong political mandate, then they potentially just become talk shops. they can come to conclusions, but governments won't necessarily act on the basis of those conclusions, Jack. So there has to be some sort of commitment device in there to ensure that what is debated and what is concluded by a citizens' jury or in a citizens' assembly actually has some real impact on the political system. And otherwise, well, nothing will happen, and good people will waste an awful lot of time.
Okay, we're scheduled to end at 8:30, and I would want to do that to honor our commitment to Jonathan. I know he's had a long day. We have 5 hands up, so you've got 2 minutes. Go, Gray.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan and Jack. You're addressing the issue of biophysical limits, and you're looking at the economy. I think you need to look at a little more closely at the connections between the biophysical limits and the economy. And I suggest there are major issues there that have got little or nothing to do with the economy. And one of them is political will and people's attitudes, people's expectations. Now, we have had situations in our society in which massive changes have been made very sudden, very rapidly for great emergencies. And we talk about COVID, we talk about wars, and people have really put an enormous effort. One of the problems is we have refused to take that approach to climate change. We have consistently said we can't tell the people the real story because it's too bad, and they won't, they'll turn off and don't listen to us. And some of that did explain a lot of the problem, but we did stop there. Now there's a book that's just come out by Bill Maguire from UK, and he goes in, looks at this in quite thoroughly. And we need to find ways of really being brave enough to actually tell the real story and get the politicians, help the politicians to put that story across.
Yes. So Gray, look, I broadly agree with you. The tragedy, I think, in terms of, say, climate change, which I know more about than many of the other issues in the ecological domain, is that very, very few politicians in any of the political parties here and in other jurisdictions are prepared to actually call a spade a spade. Very few of them, for example, talk about, you know, the global sort of atmospheric space that we have left if we were to have a reasonable chance of living within 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming. It's very rarely talked about. The need for us to reduce carbon dioxide emissions globally by around 45%, give or take some percentage points, by 2030, hardly anyone ever talks about, nor do they recognize the fact that for a developed economy like New Zealand, and for an economy which has a per capita use of carbon dioxide, which is above the global average, and a huge, cumulative use of carbon dioxide or emission of carbon dioxide over long periods of time. For an economy like New Zealand, we should be doing more than the global average, but hardly anyone, even in the Greens, kind of talks about this. So, Gray, you know, we have a problem. When I give lectures at Victoria University on this stuff, most of the students simply aren't aware of the true gravity of the challenge. They'll know we've got a problem, but they don't really understand some of the very basic maths, if I can put it that way. I don't know quite how we change that state of affairs. Anyway, there's other people, Gray, who want to have a chat, a comment.
Yeah,
so,
I'm going to turn on
addressing.
Dolph, you're next. You're muted, Dolph. Are you still there?
Hi.
Yeah.
Yes, we're here. This is Francesca Dolph, and I are both on the chat. I just wanted to say that we need the commitment device. I absolutely agree with it. And I also feel that to change the mindset of people is one of the most important issues. And we can't change the mindset of the world, but we need to work on changing the mindset within New Zealand, and that we are above the average of what we should be emitting. And therefore, there is a petition going at the moment which asks for the government to regularly have conferences about what policies they're putting in, what can be done, what people need to do, what businesses need to do. So I ask people, please sign that. That's one thing, because I really do believe that it's got to do with how we look at the world. And Greta Thunberg a little while ago was all about listen to the scientists, but now she's saying, listen to the people who are already affected. They're called the MEPA, the most affected people in the world. And every day there are things about climate change happening, and it's not mentioned, as you see. But one of the issues is New Zealand, we can become an island of well-being, like Molly said, and work on what can be done, because can't influence the wars and all those. We have to stick in our backyard and look what can we do. And I feel having that petition and somehow gaining the awareness of how big the problem is, by saying, look what's happening around the world. And yeah, and that's really, I feel, the crux of it, because
So Dolph, forgive me, I hear you. There's other people who want to have a quick word. So could you come to the point?
Really emphasize the point of we need a commitment device.
Yeah.
And that we need to work on towards the government and look at it within New Zealand, because we can't influence the world.
Sure. So Dolph, first of all, we need multiple commitment devices. I completely agree with you. Secondly, it would be wonderful if New Zealand could be, if you like, a light to the rest of the world, but we're not at the moment, and I don't see much prospect of us becoming such a light. Third, it would be wonderful if we could be a little more self-sufficient, but we're not at the moment, and probably we can't be in the near term. So we are heavily dependent on the rest of the world in all manner of respects. Many of our citizens live overseas, and we are heavily dependent at the moment on all kinds of inputs from overseas jurisdictions. So one of the things that I think we just need to be mindful of is that as the impacts of climate change grow globally and disrupt economies, disrupt production of food, disrupt production of goods and services of various kinds, we are going to be affected by that because we're part of the global economy. And the fourth thing, very quickly, well-being. Look, I've got nothing against well-being, but to be frank, well-being can mean all manner of things. The subjective well-being, objective well-being, multiple measures of objective well-being. Simply saying we need to focus on well-being, while I do not necessarily disagree, is an easy thing to say, but much harder to achieve. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Mark, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan, for your very interesting
quickly,
survey.
please. Yep.
Sorry?
Quickly, please, so we have two other.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks.
My question, if I can get it in, is have you followed any of the work of Professor Tim Garrett? He had a paper that came out in 2012. It's entitled, rather pessimistically, No Way Out. I have to feel that I'm very much feeling along his lines, that he looks at at our civilization as rather in the same vein that Nate Hagens does, as a superorganism, and he looks at the energy situation that's required for that organism to grow or even to sustain itself. And he comes out with some very interesting figures, not least a correlation between GDP and energy consumption. In fact, growth in energy consumption. So in other words, if you just sustain the organism, the civilization, I think he's got a figure of about 5 gigawatt hours per $1 trillion, US 1990 $1 trillion of accumulated wealth. So his conclusion really is that we have got commitments and energy that we cannot get away from if we're sustaining our civilization. I think collapse is the only conclusion. So that may be a paper. Well, if you haven't come across that, I'm happy to send you.
No, Mark. So the short answer is no, I haven't. But his conclusion may well be valid. Yeah,
I'll send you a copy of the paper.
I've written it down. I'll look it up. But
yes.
Just to say, on no way out, I often show my students a picture of a flooded major city in Asia. Could be Bangkok, it could be Manila, which has no U-turn. With people in boats and sort of swimming rather. Sorry, I shouldn't make a fun of this, but it's
you
okay.
have to keep it light. Yes.
We have to retain some humor in these dark times. Okay, we have two last questioners here. First, Catherine, and then Tim.
Thank you, Jack. Yes. Thanks, Jonathan, for your great talk. I'm interested in your views on export and import. It seems to me this sort of economy is driving overexploitation of resources and people and inequality. Would it be useful or helpful at all to somehow say maybe we have to address that, reduce this export-import reliance and build on self-sufficiency at different levels? However it's possible by nations, or is it too naive or maybe even cruel to suggest that?
So look, Catherine, it's a very good question. I'm probably disposed to the view that nations are probably going to want to become a little more independent in a number of important areas because of what's been happening in recent times, and that would be energy independence and food independence. Having said that, there are limits to the extent to which many countries can become independent. And if you're in Singapore, there's a limit to how much food you can grow for 6 million people. We in New Zealand obviously can grow far more food than we need, and there are plenty of people in other jurisdictions who need that food. So look, it raises all the issues around, comparative advantage, the economics of international trade and so on, which is not my field. And I really don't know how things are going to change over the next few decades. But I can see probably various forces at work that will encourage a greater degree of self-reliance than has been the case. In other words, I think globalization may have reached its kind of pinnacle, and it's probably in a modest retreat at the moment. But how radical that retreat will be, I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's hope. Okay, Tim, you've got the last couple of minutes.
Thanks, Jack. Try and keep this question quite short. Jonathan, sort of going back to what you said earlier, focusing on policy within the next, let's say, 1 to 3 years, so short-term focus, what areas of policy, while the larger ideological questions play out, what areas of policy do you think that green growth advocates or Green New Deal advocates on the one hand and degrowth advocates can agree on in the near future, specifically in a New Zealand context, acknowledging there are areas they're going to disagree on?
Well, I mean, I would certainly hope that they would agree on the need for urgent shift in some significant areas of policy. Transport would be one, agriculture would be another, forestry is probably another. So, there are various things that I suspect sane green growthers and sane degrowthers would recognize were fundamental to a more sustainable economy and society. But look, there isn't time to go through them sort of one by one now, Tim. I suspect you and I would agree on many things. The disagreement, to the extent that degrowthers actually are committed to some reduction in GDP, or at least no further growth in GDP, to the extent that there would be disagreement, it would be about the extent to which a strategy of degrowth will facilitate or undermine the capacity to make the sorts of policy shifts in transport policy, agricultural policy, forestry policy that are required. And well, as I indicated very briefly in my presentation, there are a variety of reasons why that debate will go on. The degrowthers will doubt the arguments that advocates of green growth advance for why having at least moderate growth will facilitate more rapid change.
Thanks.
Very good. Oh, and we've finished right on time. Jonathan, many, many, many thanks for a very stimulating and very broad perspective on these incredibly complex issues. The slides that Jonathan has used this evening will be available on the Our Climate Declaration website in a few days, along with the video recording of this session, if you'd like to go over any bits and pieces or recommend it to colleagues and friends. And I'll just close with a reminder that there are some groups looking at how we deal with this predicament. What Jonathan has done is given us a very broad overview and indicated many of the uncertainties and complexities and challenges. But it seems that an additional step we might attempt to take together is to say, what's the best and most useful things that we can do from that panoply of options that we have available, and try to make the best of what is likely to be a very difficult situation. But it's still, no matter how difficult it's going to be, we can make it a little better or a little worse, and that is important. So if you're interested in those things, join our climate declaration, join the degrowth group that, again, Deirdre has put the link on earlier, and other groups that you may feel akin to, because it's important that we keep this work going and don't give up. Thanks again, Jonathan, and thanks again to the rest of you, Jack, for your contributions, and we'll keep at it.
Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks for your attention. Thanks, Jack, for setting this up, and all the very best.
All the best, Jonathan. Keep well. Bye-bye. Good night, all.
Good night.